Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Oh man, once again, we have a special guest host back with us, Christian Rivera, INTP Preferences. Hi, Christian.
Hi, good to be here.
Christian works with us as, you're jack of all trades now. You media producer, art director. You come to our live events, help us film, edit, do all the stuff behind the scenes, but now you're getting more involved in front of the scenes.
Yes.
Been on the show a lot, and you're also helping us with our new Quest program, so our new Quest membership, which is awesome.
Yes, I show up every Sunday. We talk. I'm less of a ghost. I'm here in front. I'm trying to use the bass in my voice more and just showing up, talking, and also sharing ideas with you guys to talk about on the podcast.
Yeah. And just quick note, speaking of Quest, if you're listening or watching along, you should be part of this. Every week, right now, currently on Sundays, we're gathering a group of like minds in a tribe format to watch the weekly podcast together. And then immediately afterward, we're going into a members only Zoom call, calling it a personality quest. And we talk about the episode. We talk about the application to our own lives and growth. And then we give everybody a challenge that week. We call it a personality quest to go out and test in your real life, come back and unpack it the following week. And it's been really great. We've been doing this for a few weeks now. And I think this is here to stay.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. I love being able to interact with each other, like on the Zoom calls and in the comments and all that stuff. It's fantastic to hear what people have to share about these episodes. Get real-time feedback.
Well, and I think it's relevant to what I want to talk about today, because our goal here at Personality Hacker is always to find the practical application of personality types, not just Myers-Briggs, all the different systems, but we primarily focus on Myers-Briggs. We're always looking for, how do we apply this to our lives? How do we make this real for ourselves? Not just a theoretical experiment or a debate we want to have online, or, just to entertain or enrich our minds. Like, we don't want to just understand. We also want to use it to gamify our lives, to solve problems, to optimize the self. And so I think today what we want to talk about is a model that you brought to the table, Christian, that you want to share with us, unpack some of the key concepts of it. And then we're going to do a short series going deeper into this model that we think, if you're listening or watching, will help you apply personality types to your life to basically grow in a personal growth way. So I don't know how to set up any more than that, but I think you can.
Well, it's funny. I'm starting to be the guy that comes in and brings the biggest possible models to talk about and like deconstruct and break down and see where this goes. Right. But there is very practical application that these big models bring. Like we talked about generational theory in previous episodes, and that's a big thing, but we're all a part of generations and it's stuff to think about. Yep. Whereas, we are a business that is facilitating maturity and personal growth. And I think that if we start talking about growth in a couple of different frameworks, we can really start to hone in on where we are as individuals through our growth process. So I wanted to present to you guys this framework that I got from Ken Wilber. He is the founder, and some people would say the father, of integral theory, which is similar to spiral dynamics as like a growth model. It's a spiral development model. And he talks a lot about a lot of his work is massive. It's dense. He's written over like 50 books. Like, he's just a crazy author. He just writes so much stuff, and it's a lot of stuff that's it's very heady. It's very intellectual. It's a lot to take in. So what I'm hoping to do is, as a creative INTP, part of my magic is I absorb a lot of information and I try to reimagine it for us to be able to absorb and be able to bring into our lives in a way that's palatable. So what I want to talk about is this concept of grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up. This is a Ken Wilber frame where he talks about it's a method of aligning inner work and outer work. And we usually talk about a lot of inner work when we're talking about personality types, but what we're doing more is talking about how to bring personality types alive in your life, which means taking the inner work into the outer world, where a lot of the times people who are showing up into our world are taking the outer world stuff and trying to bring it into the inner world. And it's this oscillation back and forth between outer world and inner world. So what I love to propose is talking about how we can start to reimagine these ideas of grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up, tie it into what we do here at Personality Hacker, and for our listeners to be able to start to take this approach, and then maybe have a better understanding of some of the programs and offerings that we have that connect to these ideas, so that they can understand Personality Hacker as an entity a little bit more clearly. Yeah.
And also how it applies to your own life in those ways.
Yeah.
So I just want to reference a little bit of this idea you said big models. First of all, a model, just in case somebody's a little bit uninitiated, like a model would be something like the Myers-Briggs system it's a framework for us to understand people, and it's expandable. You could just understand it in a very basic way, like one dichotomy, like, oh, there's extroverts in the world or there's introverts in the world. That's a basic model of understanding something.
Yeah.
Or you can understand all 4 letters and dichotomies. You can understand, oh, I'm an ENFP. I have ENFP preferences. So that says something about me. And you can go deeper into cognitive functions and archetypes if you want to, and shadow type material. So that's a model as an example. Another model would be something very simple like Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a model. You kind of understand where you are on like a need base.
Right.
Are you at the survival level? Are you at safety, security? Are you at relationship and love and belongingness? So you kind of can triangulate that.
Right.
And actually those 2 models are good to say because they're 2 different styles of model.
Yeah.
One is a horizontal model. Like there's no hierarchy to it. Everyone's equal. Like I'm an ENFP. I'm equal to you as an INTP. We're not like INTP. Maybe you'd think INTPs are better.
Yes,
higher up.
I do. And it's true. And you can't debate me on that. You will lose.
Prove me wrong. That's what you're supposed to say. Prove me wrong.
Prove me wrong.
But the point is that like, they're all on the same plane.
Yeah.
But there is a hierarchy to Maslow, right? When I'm in love and belongingness needs, I already have to have my safety and security and my survival taken care of. So there's like a level to it. You level up. So it's a vertical model. It's an upward focused model.
And I want to quickly reference too, is that some people get tripped up by the word hierarchy in general.
Oh yeah.
Like we want to flatten it and just like, no, everyone's equal on every territory. And I want to delineate real quick this idea of a growth hierarchy, which is what we're talking about.
Yes.
It's maturing, progressive. It's maturing through our lives. It's collecting experience points versus like dominator hierarchies, which is usually what a lot of people are being very critical of when it's someone abuses a power or does something where they take advantage of being in a hierarchy and, making someone undermining them or something like that. So I just wanted to address that right away so that someone doesn't hear the word hierarchy and immediately get turned off by this idea. Yeah. So I think that's a good starting point.
Sure. So then I think what Ken Wilber's work has done is what I understand about integral theory and what Ken Wilber and they've all done at the Integral Institute is that they've said, okay, there's all these smaller models like Myers-Briggs and Maslow's hierarchy. And they basically said there needs to be some kind of an overarching meta model for all of this so we can kind of bring it all together to understand the layers and the complexities of all. That's the work they do, is try to understand where all the models fit together from what I can understand about their work.
Ken Wilber as a person, he talked about what he was doing in his work is he took all of these different models that he was thinking about, as some examples also, like what you mentioned was important, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, things like that, but things like masculine and feminine, or thinking about avatars and gods, like Greek gods, different archetypes, trickster archetypes, things like that come out. The idea of being a role model and filling out your different roles. There's this idea of role person merger, and some people embody certain avatars or archetypes and experiences. Archetypes, shadow work, like all these different psychological systems and models. He laid everything out on, tables obsessively and stuff for a long time and tried to look at what the patterns between it all were, which is like a monumental effort. Yeah. Which is why I respect him greatly in all of his work. Yeah. And, all of that leads to some work that he calls the 4-quadrant model, which is kind of big and intense. Yeah. It's really touching on this idea of interior individual, interior collective, exterior individual, and exterior collective. So when we talk about aligning inner work and outer work, it's kind of looking at that. If we go to the furthest reaches of pulling back as far as we can, I think that's as far as like I think I've witnessed is this idea of inner and outer. It's like this duality.
Yeah. And just for the listener, you don't necessarily have to know integral theory and you don't have to know the meta model, because we're just going to talk about some of the key concepts somewhat divorced from that model. But if you'd like to reference back, we've done podcast episodes on, we called it Graves model, AKA spiral dynamics. Yeah. Because they're almost interchangeable. The reason why is because Claire Graves was the original discoverer of the model. So the Graves model, and then it got handed off to particularly like Don Beck as a steward. and he wrote a couple books on spiral dynamics.
Yep.
And Don Beck, Don Beck says in one of his courses that when Claire Graves was working on this, now Claire Graves is long dead, and Don Beck is getting elderly. He's getting up in years. And Ken Wilber was kind of this fresh student. He was like a college student when he discovered Claire Graves' work, and he just became obsessed with it.
Yep.
And so Don Beck talks about how this kid, Ken Wilber, kept writing them and asking them more questions. And then I would say that at this point, even though Don Beck is still alive and writing content, Ken Wilber he comes down from that lineage of that meta model. And that's what spiral dynamics was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a meta model where a bunch of other metals fit into it.
And I've started to use the term spiral development. It's kind of like a general overarching term, kind of birthed from this idea that, yes, these models are representing the idea that we grow. And as we grow, we're usually oscillating between a couple of different ideas. Different models will tell you which ideas we're oscillating between, but it might be individual or collective sort of frames and focuses, or it might be sort of more left brain analytic and then more holistic thinking. You know, that kind of idea. We've talked about analytic and holistic thinking on this podcast quite a bit. And so bringing this idea of, for me personally, as a creative person, when I'm trying to be creative, usually I'll go as to the far reaches as I can of an idea. Yeah. And then I'll sort of pendulum swing, but pivot a little bit too. Yeah. It's like you go back and you try something opposite, but let me try something a little different. I don't want to go back to where I just came from. That's not exciting. That's not very interesting. And I'm not just saying that as an intuitive. I think we all do a version of that, just at varying speeds. And you just go back and you try something different. So when I'm talking about spiral development, it's like going forward, but like, let's try this for a while. And then let's try this other side for a little while. And then we just keep kind of pivoting back and forth and trying different things and developing and growing.
Yeah, I think that's, and I like that they originally chose a spiral to illustrate that, but I think that's very apt. Yeah. It's like when we grow through growth and development, there is an oscillation in our forward movement. And then that all by itself creates a certain perspective, right? Particularly since as people, we tend to have a bias believing that wherever we're at is sort of the acme of where a person can be. Yeah. Like, I mean, when we get into growth and development, we start to realize, oh, maybe that's not true. Maybe there's a lot of other levels. Yeah. Oh, in fact, there might be so many levels that I'm going to die before I reach even like, maybe close to what the highest echelon
is. Yeah, as far as we know, there's really no limit.
Right.
I mean, there's limits of what we can observe, and there's fewer people on the planet that gets to the upper echelons. But I think some of what we want to talk about over the course of, I don't know if I named that this is basically going to be a series, but when I show up, it's always a series. There's a lot of stuff to talk about.
NTPs, man, you never stop talking.
It's just got a lot of stuff, it's just clogging up the pipes, and I got to put it somewhere. I might as well make it useful, So the idea here is that, what I want to propose is talking about this grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up aspect, and sort of redefining it for ourselves and our audience, and taking some creative liberties. Yeah. But also doing so in a way that creates a little bit more practical tangibility to it, meaning that, what we tend to do as people, there's this concept of spiritual bypassing that I think we get very wrapped up in when we get into personal growth work. It's like this idea, I hear shadow work all the time. And what I hear people referencing when they talk about shadow work is actually trying to cleanse themselves. That's more of a purifying frame, which is, I don't think is the healthiest way to look at it, or getting to a place of kind of, they think of the higher levels of development. Like if someone is new to spiral dynamics, for example, and they look at the higher levels, they might idealize those higher levels and think of them as like a place that I'll get to where I'll never feel pain ever again. And that's just not the case, and it's not to discourage you from developing and growing as a person, but that, you just get better at managing the human experience. Yeah. And I think that's what we want to essentially talk about.
So it's almost like this idea, it's almost like a Judeo-Christian concept of there is a heaven to attain. Maybe you don't do it through like a God figure or purification in a religious sense, but there's some personal growth element. I'll arrive at some quote heaven spot where I don't have my problems. I can sit on the beach and chill, or I can be Zen in any space. And what you're saying is that's not really how it works. Like we're always going to be developing and improving. There's never an end point to that where we just kick back, pop the cork off the champagne and like, I've arrived.
Yeah. Well, I'm like that you use the word arrived, because to me, it's even more so like a musician believing that once they make it big, right, then all the problems go away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that it is an idea. And I think in personal growth, and I think it's something that a person needs to keep their finger on the pulse of at the very beginning of the journey, is that there is going to be a very natural human tendency to want to have arrived. And because that actually isn't something that happens through personal development,
right?
If a person is trying to achieve it through personal development, what ends up happening is there's a lot of affectation.
Right.
Oh.
And that's when a lot of the spiritual bypassing happens. It's like, well, what do people who I think might have arrived, what do they look like? And what are they doing? And how are they showing up? And then there's an affectation of that. Maybe it's a fake it till you make it, which unfortunately, personal development is the one place you can't fake it till you make it. It's like the one that will call you on it. It's just too honest work. And so, but there is a desire to do that. And so, so I think I like the concept that the series addresses this idea that there is no such thing as arriving.
Yeah. And, I can't remember who said this quote, but someone said something to the degree of like, personal growth and spiritual growth will elevate you or it'll expose you. And that's sometimes exposing our ideals. Sometimes it's like, pushing us beyond how much we've been tamping ourselves down and maybe seeing ourselves as like this muck of a person and really like hurting ourselves and keeping ourselves from actually living and experiencing life. So this idea of not necessarily spiritual bypassing, but then also not like demonizing ourselves so much that we don't participate in life either. Right. It's not about squashing the ambition of looking at a later worldview and saying, I want to try to get there. It's like, I think of it more of a healthy view of, or at least what I perceive as a healthy view of looking at a mountain, like a fuzzy mountain in the distance, and you can take any number of paths to get there. And so referencing throughout this series is going to be referencing quite a few different models that could be supportive, things that we've talked about in podcast episodes previously, or, potentially things we'll talk about in the future to navigate that road, however you need to naturally navigate it to get to whatever that big blurry mountain is in the distance for you.
Okay. I love the simple framework of this. Grow up, wake up, clean up, show up. I love the fact that the word up is directional. Like it's not a deliverable that you're looking for, an outcome. It's a direction you're going to. I'm going to wake up. I'm going up in my waking ability or whatever. That's how I see it. And I like the words grow, wake, clean, and show. I think these are very basic, simple words. Most people have a sense of what they mean, but let's just give, I think in this episode, we want to kind of give an index. We'll go into these deeper in the next few series throughout the series. But right now, so first of all, how is this in a meta way or like in an overarching way? How are we attuning to this? Like, what's the learning we take from this in a real applicable way? Like, why are we even, let's just talk about the why for a second. What does this do for us? Why?
And is it linear?
Yeah. And so that pendulum swing idea is interesting to think about because that's the spiral part of it there's forward, but then we kind of oscillate back and forth and we have these fits and starts and sometimes we drop back a little bit. You talked about, you have this really great podcast episode about spiral dynamics in what's the word you use to talk about like kind of the spectrum of where you are. It's like so when you're talking about spiral dynamics, you have this like center of gravity at a level of development. And sometimes depending on your life circumstances, just loosely as an example, you can kind of drop back a little bit, or sometimes you go forward a little bit. If you have like kind of a peak experience and you're in like a really great flow state, you can sort of jump into the next level a little bit. So it's not quite linear in terms of you're always going forward, but there is this kind of slow gravitational force based on our life circumstances that tend to pull us forward. And how you're tracking that depends on the model you're thinking about and stuff like that. Yeah. So with what you were asking, Joel, I think there's this really great quote that I pulled from Ken Wilber that might help us transition to what we're talking about. And he says that growing up, waking up, cleaning up, and showing up are these things that we often talk about in his integral world called the 4 ups. The first 3 all have to do with our inner work, the often grueling personal work we do within our consciousness and closest relationships. But the 4th, showing up, which is where we'll land on, is where the fruits of our labor truly begin to ripen, where all of our accumulated knowledge, personal growth, spiritual practice, and shadow work become a limitless source of strength, presence, and wisdom, allowing us to engage the many dimensions and challenges of our world in a far more meaningful and impactful way. From becoming a parent to becoming a better leader to becoming a better citizen of the world. After all, if our practice does not help us show up more fully in the world, if it does not compel us to enact real change within each of our own spheres of influence, if it does not equip us to directly confront the many terrors and tragedies of our collective unfolding with fearless compassion and skillful action, then what's the point? If the sum total of our practice cannot benefit the world around us, exactly what or whom are we practicing for? And to that end, that made me think also that one of the big things that we can tend to fixate on is one side or the other, this inner world aspect or outer world aspect. It's like you were saying before, it's like, if I save the world, I'll be better. If I have the house and all these cars, then I will be better. If I become a better moral person and I contribute to the church, I'm going to be a better person. You know, there's these often external markers of how I'm going to be a better person and how I'm going to contribute to my life. But there's this wonderful frame that Oranio Pius mentioned once in some of the work we had done with him in the past, that he said that we have often touch points with up to 90,000 people in our lives. Like, we have this vast network of connections of influence than we realize. And often we're always focusing on like, how do I make the world better? How do I make you better? How do I make that person better? How do I make that person stop that behavior? When really it's like learning to develop a calmer nervous system. It's better. It's like, how do we find a way to show up in service and joy? How do we show up as a demonstration of calm, focus, work, presence, exuberance, persona, contribution, all of these ideas? And my hope is that not only through this series, but through the work that you do with us or do wherever you end up going to do some of this work, that you start to transition into a showing up, not just telling everyone how they should be or telling yourself how you're supposed to be or should be, but like you're just honestly just doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because some of those markers, I understand the psychology behind that, because when a system is running well, then there's going to be certain emergence. Mm-hmm. And so we get really hyper focused on what those emergence can be from a properly running system. Mm-hmm. And I'll know, like we were talking about before, arrived. I'll know I have arrived when I have these markers. I'll know that I'm successful when I have these markers.
Yeah.
And so it's understandable that people would hyper focus on the marker. The challenge is that some really great, healthy systems running can have different emergence than the one we expect. Mm-hmm. And that's when individuality gets infused into it. Mm-hmm. It's like I could have an equally healthy, thriving system as somebody else who has some of the markers you're talking about, mm-hmm. but my emergence is slightly different.
Right.
And so going back and looking at the system itself, that's the quote unquote, the inner work, mm-hmm. is making sure that the system is running well and not getting too attached on what the emergent is supposed to be.
Well, and inherently an emergent is not usually predictable.
Yeah.
There's a degree of there's a degree of faith to it. All you can really do is, like you're saying, kind of like tweak the system and update the system of your system, not necessarily the external systems. Though mm-hmm. if you have an influence on some things, sure. But as an individual person, usually what we have control over is the actual literal systems in our body or mm-hmm. the mechanisms that we're actually directly connected to actually contribute. So there's a degree of faith here that the emergent that you'll kind of end up in, the role or purpose of your life or your unique self, will emerge as a result of doing all of this work. It might not necessarily be what you think you'll ultimately become.
Mm-hmm. So can we workshop a way to say why we're talking about this right now? Like, mm-hmm. in other words, I mean, I know why, like inherently, I know why we're talking about this, mm-hmm. but I want to give somebody that's watching or listening right now an access point. I don't know if it would be like they could think of something tangible in their life to have like in their mind as we walk through this series, if there's a definition or understanding of what they can be kind of like meditating on. Cause I can see somebody going, okay, these words seem simple, but you guys are talking about this in such an abstract way.
Yeah.
Like I'm getting lost on why does this matter? What, like, okay, I grow up, that seems like it's a normal maturation process, I guess. Wake up. That's just being like aware of like bigger ideas and concepts, which I would argue if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are aware of bigger ideas and concepts because you're seeking them out. You're trying to find more ways to understand the self. Cleanup is a lot about probably, maturing and we're going to go through in these in depth, but, and then show up as that contribution where I see a lot of people rushing to, right? They're starting or they're hoping that contribution can then do the inner work.
They're trying to do the analytic left brain manufacturing of it and
Yes.
less of like the kind of faith emergence aspect that I was talking about.
Like I think of the show, The Good Place. In the show, The Good Place, they kept saying like, we just fix the outer behavior and then the inner heart state will follow. It's like, I think that's like the general mentality of how to improve the world right now. That's like it feels like that's what everybody, like we got to get the right policy through a government agency. We've got to get the right social conditions set. We got to get the right framework. Everybody's got to believe the same thing. We all have to do the same kind of practice. If we can sync up socially and as a culture, that's going to fix all that. And then immediately all our inner spaces are going to just take care of themselves.
Yeah. If all 8 billion people just behave.
Yes. If we all just do it,
we'll be fine.
But I think that's where all the effort and attempt seems to be. It's like all in the outer external world. And then you get conflict and you get war and all the other things that come from, humans wanting to make it how they see it in the outer world.
Well, and sometimes I think that's an emergent of sort of working from what ultimately disciplined us in the first place, which might be an institution, it might be religion, it might be something that at some point when we were kids, like kids are madness. I mean, I love my kids dearly, but if I let them unleash on each other without any discipline, like one would probably murder the other for a fruit roll up.
Yes.
Like it's we're
well deserved.
Right. And like some of this like growing up process is like ultimately landing on an acceptance process of the fact that like we're also id creatures like our kids are. We kind of romanticize children. Not that we need to go to the other side and villainize them and do what happened to Gen Xers. But
thank you. I'm glad you recognized it.
You're welcome. It's not that we need to go to the other side of that, but it's seeing within ourselves. It's like, for example, we might blame our parents for a lot of our challenges, which may have been like, maybe they were alcoholic, maybe there was some really genuinely terrible stuff in your past, but also like your parents, if they were not dealing with all of those things, like they were probably just trying their best and you were a little monster and they didn't know how to reconcile with that. Or like they didn't have the tools that we have today of personality types, of therapy, of like all of these different psychological tools that have been coming online. I often say that we're at this like interesting cutting edge of social technologies that like just wasn't available for a lot of people beyond even like 10 years ago. So it's a lot of forgiveness for that and understanding those aspects of the fact that we were these kind of id kids that needed to be socialized so that we can have a civilization at some point, right? That at some point we needed to get off of like, stealing things at our local grocery store. I don't, everybody has their sort of like rebellious experience, right?
Sure.
And then at some point it's like needing some avenue to be socialized. For a lot of people that's going through a religion or an AA program through it to land on a religion or some sort of institution or landing a job where you become a part of something. You move from this ego-focused individual want, like, with reckless abandon and then sort of submitting yourself to something. But then you go through kind of later stages of life and that sort of like over submission no longer serves you.
Yeah.
So how do you become an individual again? And that's part of the oscillation I'm talking about, is how do we start to let go of some of the stuff that is no longer serving us? That's what a lot of our personality life path ends up doing, is detangling from our relationship to having had to be highly disciplined at one point, but we no longer really need that anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So some of the reason why this is such a powerful model is based on the Ken Wilber quote that you just read a couple minutes ago, if a person is focused on contribution, this is how to make it as effective as possible and not keep banging your head against the wall, which it's like, if all 8 billion people could just get on the same page, Well, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
So if you want to be in a contributor frame, then this is the recipe to do it as effectively as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were reading it, there were two things I would quibble with Ken Wilber on, not because I think he's inaccurate. And of course, anytime we communicate anything that's a big idea, we're going to have to oversimplify some concepts in between. So it's not like I disagree with him or anything. I agree with that entire quote.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing I would quibble a little bit on is that the steps that I see that lead up to finally show up, which is the more contributor place,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not just inner work and then outer work. It's like you said, it's like a constant oscillation between them. And I'm sure he would agree with that. He's simplifying it so that it's an accessible concept.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is, if we're not contributing, what's the point of all of it?
Mm-hmm.
I think a person can live a very rich life choosing to do personal growth work to
Mm-hmm.
find their whole self.
Yeah.
To make it so that contribution isn't the target,
Mm-hmm.
but it still's an emergent.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've noticed that when people do work to find their whole self,
Mm-hmm.
they almost always have a positive impact on the systems around them, whether or not they're focused on it and really trying to push something through.
Mm-hmm.
They just end up being a contributor
Mm-hmm.
in whatever way, because they show up as a quality person that
Mm-hmm.
has wisdom to impart
Yeah.
or a calm nervous system that other
Mhm.
people can relax around. So I think regardless of whether or not you're a person who's really into contribution, which I think, excuse me, certain generations are more focused on,
Mm-hmm.
or whether or not you're just a person who wants to become the best version of yourself, or for me, it's the most version of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a really good sort of schematic
Mhm.
for how to determine where you're at in this process,
Mm-hmm.
sort of audit or, diagnose where a person is at, and then maybe some of the things that you can go back and revisit and pick up,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And really
Pickup. That's another one. Pickup is
Yeah.
the next, the fifth category.
Before we were doing all the jokes of throw up, pick up, spit up,
Wipe up.
Well, wipe up,
Whatever it is.
whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
This is a nice way to go. Okay, where am I actually at? And again, I would say that for me, when I look at this list, and we'll deep dive into each one of these and the significance, and
Mm-hmm.
what exactly does that mean, and how can we modify it to ourselves?
Yeah.
But when I look at all of these, I have a tendency to go, I might need to go back and revisit that one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not I collected, I got through the level and I got the flag at the end.
Yeah,
and-
it's not a one and done.
Yeah, exactly. And now I'm off to the next level.
I would argue it's actually harder once you get to like a show up place and you know what it feels like it's like performing on stage. You have to do all this like kind of maintenance work to make sure that you're prepared to be able to perform in the way that you need to perform or want to perform. And I think at some point during our growth stages in life, it's like, I think it's very appropriate to be radically self-focused. Like I don't have a personal desire to quote unquote save the world. I don't actually think the world is broken. And I know many people would disagree with me on that kind of feeling, but I genuinely just want to show up in service and joy in terms of like, and I'm radically selfish in that pursuit. Like I want to be like, I want to have fun. I want to enjoy my life, but I also, part of fun for me is like consolidating all of this stuff and having conversations with you. And then it has the emergent of like someone who's listening will be like, oh, that's really interesting. And then want to dive in and that'll help with them personal growth. It's almost like I'm having greater potency by focusing on what brings me joy than if I were deliberately trying really hard to make things happen on the outside world. And that's specifically my frame. It might be very different for others who have much more of an outer contributing desire, but like, everyone's path is individual. And that's really what we're trying to encourage and share. And with this framework.
Did we sell the idea well enough? Or do you think we still need to land the plane on why somebody might want to hear this?
No, I think it's good. And as we're talking, I'm realizing I don't now see this in any kind of linear fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I almost see it as like buckets that have to be filled up, or like, there's like in a video game or something where there's like there's 4 levels and each one needs to be filled all the way up.
Mm-hmm. And
you can work on any one of them at any time. And in fact, you're always going to be continually working on all 4 at all times.
Right.
But you're probably going to be focused on one. Like you might be, I'm guessing a child, for example, at the age of 12, is primarily going to be growing up in their life. They're maturing. They're trying to figure stuff out. And we're going to get into this in a minute. You know, I might have some more refined thinking in the next episode as we start talking about it. But, and then somebody that's maybe they've done a lot of work, they're going to be more in their I'm more in my contributor frame right now. I'm more in the show up frame. I'm having to show up so much that I actually need to go and attend to some of the other things. Like I need to probably do a little cleanup. Like I think, you know, I've been kind of we've been doing a lot this summer up until the time we were this recording and everything. And I'm like a little cortisol, filled with like, I'm in like a high stress state because we've been running and doing a lot of stuff. I need to go and clean that up and be a little bit more chill and zen and kind of get some of those things in order. So, because I've been in such output, I've been showing up so much that you have to go and it's almost like you fill up the gas tank in some other way.
Right.
And I think you hit certain plateau or levels and you don't have to regress necessarily, but I think also the gas tank can empty out in some of this stuff.
Well, there's an aspect of humility that comes through doing that kind of work too. It's like, because we get really excited about a new level or a new territory. Like if we literally walk into a new territory, especially as NPs, it's like, there's new possibilities. It's excitement. It's like this new place. And I just want to stay here. But it's like remembering that in order to have gotten there, it's like this delicate house of cards that needs to be tended to in order for you to be able to stay there. So you just want to stay there all the time. And that actually ends up undermining you by trying to stay at the highest place that you could possibly get to. It's kind of like, again, with spiral dynamics, you could peak into the next level and it's like, I want to be here all the time. It's like, well, your center of gravity is not quite that.
Right.
You still need to kind of pull back, like you said, do some cleanup work or do some wake up, someone who is growing and they have a first wake up experience of like dancing on stage and you're like, I want to do this all the time, when really like they might need to go back into doing some sort of like muscle group developing, or they might need to develop some maturity so that they can, set up the shows for them to be able to do that more often or something like that.
Okay. So we've got this idea of inner and outer. You'd said, so that's one lever. And the other lever, the other axis is collective versus personal. Is that what you said? Individual or collective? What's
individual collective.
So individual collective. So, and we can map these 4 ups to that model, almost like a quadrant, or is that too tidy to think of it that way?
That might be too tidy. Yeah. I don't want to get too tidy. I think it's because the individual listening is really going to have to map this to what their experience is. Because I mean, grow up spans across interior, exterior, collective, individual, right? So it's like, where are you on the grow up? And then it depends on which developmental model you kind of become obsessed about, right? It can be spiral dynamics, it could be integral theory, it could be the stages model, the Enneagram, which I'll talk about in the next episode, like what those models could be. Okay.
So is there anything else people need to know, the listener or viewer right now needs to know before we jump into the next episode? Because I want to give them because next week we're going to pick up, we're going to go down into the grow up part. What else should we frame here to make sure we've got a good map legend for where we're heading?
I have a thing that comes up for me whenever we talk about this.
Yes, go.
I don't want to derail you, so let me know if I'm like going wildly outside of the reins.
No, my only thing is that just kind of an index of where we're going is like, we are going to talk about grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up. And we're going to be taking creative liberties about how we express that. So grow up, we're going to be kind of talking about accelerating maturity and growth and sharing some of these developmental models. Wake up is kind of like witness consciousness and what that means to wake up, like couple different ways to have wake up experiences, and then kind of what waking up on a more regular basis looks like with mindfulness or something like that. And then clean up being more ego focused, like ego, persona, shadow, self, that kind of thing, facing yourself, self-diagnosis. And then show up is the emergent process, that faith-based process. And then also all of the cleanup work of the 3 levels previously, what it takes to be consistently showing up to contribution, to presence, and to, frankly, a more adaptable persona.
Yeah. Okay. So you said the thing that I was going to say and you wove it in all of that. So apparently I'm not going to go too far outside the territory line.
Great.
Here we go.
But to weave this in, there's 2 things coming up for me. The first one is that I recently heard somebody who we follow say, do you want to understand your problem or do you want to solve your problem? And it really struck me because I'm an understand things kind of person.
Yeah.
And
dun, 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 dun.
And so the
hashtag NTP problems.
Exactly. And so I think that as we go through this, if we can point out all the ways, because that's actually, to me, that's like that's the ultimate spiritual bypass, is hyper focusing on understanding something and not actually moving into solving. And we can get really good at tricking ourselves into believing that our level of understanding all by itself is going to move the needle. And so we just have to understand it more. And this is an understanding a concept podcast series.
Right.
So if we can bring it back to like, okay, and then how would one use this to solve? I think that would be really good.
I just want to make one comment to that. I think I think it's well intended. The reason why people listening to this, and even us, lean toward the understanding part is because probably if you're listening or watching right now, you don't see your life or challenges necessarily as problems. You might see your life as something to be optimized. So if I can understand it, then I can optimize it. So the problem challenge, like the problem solution framework, I think I don't really buy that anymore. I don't see problems in my life. I mean, I do, but the moment I reframe those to how can I optimize, it immediately reframes it from a problem. So I think people are outsmarting themselves. And so that's kind of why they don't focus on solving the problem.
Yeah.
It's like we need to kind of go back to the unsophisticated way of seeing it like that.
Yeah.
Like it is a problem. We have to find a solution. And then we can upgrade that to say, actually, life is a game to be optimized. It's not a problem to solve ultimately.
Right.
Yeah. Cause both are simultaneously true, right?
Correct.
And it's like, which one is the more helpful for him to come from at any given time?
So I just want to make that comment.
Well, and then to piggyback off what you just said, the other thing is that, and we've said it a million times, or at least I've said it a million times, the best prescription comes from the best diagnostic.
Yeah.
So there is something to be said for really understanding what's going on here so that you can prescribe the best solution. The challenge is just never getting to prescription, just getting so knee deep or hip deep or then shoulders deep. And then now you're submerged and drowning in understanding and diagnostic. Then you never actually get to solution. So I think that's something, I'm just keeping my finger on the pulse of, do you want to understand it or do you want to solve it?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, Ken Wilber talks about that as like the difference between kind of the spiritual talk versus the spiritual walk. And in the sense that he's using the word spiritual as like a discovery of the self, not in like a high-minded kind of way, but just in this like intellectualizing, which is, again, we need to learn and we understand and we need to have tools and all of that stuff. But it's one thing to optimize yourself as like maybe a physical presence, for example, but then you don't show up to a party to hang out with your friends.
Yeah.
Like, and having the experience of actually being amongst people and communing with them and contributing or whatever the case may be. So it's like oscillating between the two is where things really start to become beautiful experience for people.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's coming up for me is you mentioned it and we've talked about it in I don't remember what the podcast episode is. You'll find it and you'll put it on the editing thing. I'm sure
I will.
But we talked about the different Jungian archetypes of the self, which is the persona, which is our interface with the outside world. It's when how we decide we're going to present ourselves to others, and what is our access point going to be. The ego, which is our relationship to ourselves and how we see ourselves. The shadow, which is anything that we don't really either want to or just simply don't have access to seeing directly. So we have it be reflected back to us. So that's the shadow part of us that is us. We're just not seeing it. So another way to say it is what we're unconscious around. And then the whole self, which is the whole enchilada, right? All the parts of the self, which include those three and then more. And I think keeping those concepts in mind help understand when something is an outer game, an inner game, a combination of the two, right? And so I think throughout this, it might be good to have our finger on the pulse of like this might be both inner and outer world, implication. And that's usually persona work. Persona work is inner and outer simultaneously, which is why it's hard to master. So that's something that I might end up weaving a little bit in here just as a frame of reference. So when you said, do we understand this completely? That's like a model that I think I might end up throwing out there a couple times. So that's the only thing I was going to add to your question of, do we have everything we need before we move on to the first topic?
I think the last thing is like, you may be looking at these, after we complete this series, you might be looking at the titles and you might be, you might encourage yourself to skip steps or, go straight to shadow work because that's what you're obsessed with.
Right.
But it's really building layers of a cake. And I think you would really be of service to yourself to, after you listen to this one, to go to the grow up episode or whatever we end up naming it next, and then follow the order. Cause I think that would really be the full experience of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. They build on each other.
Yeah.
So I think what you can do if you're listening or watching along is we're ready to enter this series starting next week. you can this week begin thinking in terms of, okay, yeah, there is this concept of growing up, waking up, cleaning up, showing up. My life, I can kind of see those aspects and then tune in maybe starting next week, this idea of growing up, just in a general sense. We haven't gone into the details of it, but from your perspective, as you're listening or watching along, just what does that mean to you right now? Is that just like, oh, I've already done that. I'm in my 20s or 30s. Like I've already grown up. Like that's what kids do, right?
Right.
Or is there something that you could tune into the self to say, actually, there's other ways I could grow up in my emotions or my thoughts, or, it's a maturation. When I hear the word grow up, I think in terms of, or the words grow up, I think in terms of maturation and all that. And we're going to unpack exactly what that means next week. But before we do that, without you knowing where we're heading, just tune in a little bit to the self. I think that's really powerful as we think about this, right?
Yeah. And I'd love to know, in the comments here on personalityhacker.com, or if you're watching on YouTube, I'd love to know which of these areas like sticks out as something appealing to you. Like, what are you curious about? Are you more curious about, again, I don't want you to skip steps when listening to the series, but what is immediately sticking out to you is like, I'm intrigued by the grow up process. I'm intrigued by the wake up process. I'm intrigued by cleanup, or intrigued by show up. And so I think I'd be curious about where you are already starting to diagnose yourself as something you're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think when I hear this model and we go a little deeper and talk about it, because we actually haven't had a conversation where we've deep dived on any of these. So, or deep dove.
Deep dove.
Yeah.
I could do that for hours.
That's just what the next podcast is going to be. It's just us saying that over and over. We're just going to scat the whole time.
Yep.
So I think for me, I really see it as an opportunity to try to, even though it's so squirmy, try to keep aware of spiritual bypasses, because it's so easy for me to, it's like, do I want to believe I'm further along? Do I want to believe I've mastered it? Is there any desire coming here? Not desire to become the most me, but the desire to have already accomplished, a certain thing.
Right.
And that's always, for me anyway, a symbol that I'm probably doing some sort of spiritual bypass. Like, do I want to see myself at a certain place? And if I want it bad enough, then I will do all sorts of mental gymnastics to convince myself I've already reached it.
Yeah.
So I think what's nice about this series is that it puts a magnifying glass on each of these concepts. And I would say, are there any areas before we launch into this series that you can maybe get a hint of that you might be doing some bypassing, that you might be affecting something you actually haven't achieved yet? And what would be the symbols of that? What would be evidence that you might be bypassing? And I think the series is like a nice opportunity to do a check-in on that each step of the way.
Yeah. Where are you overvaluing yourself and where are you undervaluing yourself, to put it, more directly?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So if you have been watching or listening along, you haven't had a fourth microphone. There's been three of us here having a conversation, but we do want to hear from you. Like Christian said, come over and leave a comment, ask a question in the comments, or more importantly, share your story. Stories are compressed experiences. If you have maybe you have had exposure to some of Ken Wilber's materials and this concept before, and it really resonates with you, and you've dove into it. Dived. I don't know what to say. You've gone into it deeply. And you've applied it to your life, or you've really unpacked some of these. We'd love to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or again, share your story.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We are on YouTube. You might be watching us right now. In fact, you might be part of our Quest call, which would be super fun because it's super meta. And hello, everybody who's part of our Quest membership. And if that's the case, you can subscribe, and hit the bell that lets you know when a new episode comes out. And you can also join our Quest program to discuss this podcast and also to bring it into your life, right? That's the whole point of why we're doing what we're doing, is to not just make our brains nice, big throbbing brains, like just
big old bulges,
big old bulging brains, but also so that we can move the needle in our lives and experience all the rewards of harvesting the fruit of the labor of the insight. I like how I said that. Ooh. You should capture that for later.
Yeah.
And anyway, so
it's good.
Also, we highly recommend that you see all of this through the lens of application, and Quest is a big part of how we do that as a group. So check out the Quest program and see if that's the thing that you want to be a part of so we can talk about this episode together.
Yeah. personalityhacker.com/quest. Right now, at the time of this recording, we're doing these on Sundays, and we're gathering with a tribe of like minds, growth-minded people. Again, like Antonia said, looking to apply this to our actual existence, our actual lives, making personality types come alive. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
I'm Christian Rivera.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. Hey, it's Joel from Personality Hacker. So a big reason people get into personality types is usually to improve their relationships with other people. And you can understand key differences between you and someone else when you understand how type works. So clearly, personality type is applied to relationships. But what about the relationship with yourself? Well, personality type can also help you navigate your career, or maybe an educational path that you need to follow, or other opportunities that present themselves, and it helps you know which are the right choice for you. And ultimately, personality is the key to unlocking identity-level worldview and life purpose. It all starts with getting the owner's manual for your personality type. In this owner's manual, we cover the basics of your personality. And then we dive a layer deeper to connect your personality to your relationships, your career, your worldview, and identity. Because we believe it's your life, and it should be designed for your personality. So start your owner's manual journey at personalityhacker.com. When you access your owner's manual, I recommend focusing on the ideal day exercise first, because when you start crafting your ideal day, you're being mindful about the type of lifestyle that you want. So designing a life around how you're naturally wired makes sense, and you can finally stop fighting yourself. So come discover and develop your unique personality at personalityhacker.com.